If you're interested in tanking but not sure which of the tanks to pick, in this video I'll give you a rundown of each of them, compare them to each other, and make some recommendations for what type of players I would recommend each of them to. First of all, let's talk about Warrior. If you have anger issues that you need to vent in-game by smashing things with a giant oversized axe, this is the job for you. Warriors use combo actions to gain a resource called Beast Gauge. This can then be spent on hard-hitting actions such as this one. Much of Warrior's gameplay revolves around not letting your Beast Gauge cap, which would cause you to lose damage. And every minute you get to use an action called Inner Release, which gives you access to, believe it or not, even more actions that let you smash things even harder. While that's going on, you also have to maintain a damage buff on yourself, which can be increased up to 1 minute, making it fairly hard to accidentally drop. You'd have to be a real doofus to mess it up, which doesn't mean I never do it, but that's besides the point. The job is fairly forgiving to play because pressing your big damage button kind of just unlocks all of the other actions that you'll need to press. Additionally, good gauge management going into the buff windows isn't actually as important as it looks at first glance. When it comes to damage mitigation in comparison to other tanks, Warrior has access to a metric boatload of self-healing, to the point where some people jokingly refer to it as a green tank. You can increase your health from 1 HP to full because of the action Bloodwetting. This mitigation applies healing per weapon skill hit, meaning if there are 10 enemies around you, that is 10 applications of the self-healing effect, resulting in absolutely ridiculous healing potencies. Additionally, warriors have access to Thrill of Battle and Equilibrium, two actions that increase maximum health, apply healing bonuses, and provide more on-demand healing respectively. Warrior also uniquely benefits a lot more than the other tanks from the changes to the roll action Rampart, which increases healing effects by another 15% just by virtue of having a lot of healing effects already. In addition to that, Warrior got an upgrade to the action Vengeance, which applies even more healing, so I think you get the theme by now. Warrior's invulnerability is called Holmgang, which chains them to an opponent and stops their health from dropping below 1 HP. Its cooldown of just 4 minutes currently makes it the shortest invulnerability cooldown among all of the tanks. Because in Extreme, Savage and Ultimates, these actions are mostly, if not exclusively, used to deal with heavy hitting tank busters, especially those that would usually require tank swap or share, you don't really care about anything but the cooldown as long as the action makes you unkillable for long enough. Which is one big reason why many people see Warrior as one of the, if not the best main tank. Even before the raid tier, you're already able to see this being useful in the second Extreme trial, which allowed Warrior to deal with 2 tank swaps that happen exactly 4 minutes apart, meaning all of the other tanks, if they're main tanking, need to swap at least once, while Warriors, giga chats that they are, can just use Holmgang on both of them. The changes to Warrior and Dawntrail included 2 new damage actions to use during the burst windows called Primal Ruination and Primal Wrath, both of which are pretty fun to use, as well as the defensive action Vengeance now turning into Damnation as I mentioned already. Because healing is inherently easier to use than mitigation, since you can apply it after your hit rather than before, Warrior has the easiest to use mitigation out of all the tanks in my opinion. If you ever get slapped without enough mitigation, you can just go whoopsie and heal back to full health. All of the healing, strong invulnerability, and extremely solid mitigation make Warrior a fantastic choice to play, incredible in solo content, and also whenever your party turns a dungeon boss into solo content involuntarily. Difficulty wise, Warrior is on the easier side. Compared to all other jobs in the game, I'll give it a 2 out of 5 stars. Next up is Dark Knight. If you're the type to listen to metal at full blast while spamming a staggering amount of OG CDs, looking incredibly edgy and idle stands, and you just like having an imaginary shadowy friend because no one else will talk to you, this job is for you. Just like Warrior, Dark Knight has a gauge with a resource that they need to manage by using 2 harder hitting spender actions, Bloodspiller and Quietus. What makes the job very unique is the need to manage MP unlike any other tank. To apply a damage buff called Darksight, which is also indicated on a job gauge, they need to use one of 3 actions: Edge of Shadow, Flood of Shadow, or the Blackest Night. The first 2 are simple damage abilities that also apply the damage buff while consuming MP. But the Blackest Night, or TBN as it's very commonly abbreviated, is a mitigation tool that will grant you a free use of either damage ability if the barrier that it provides is fully consumed by whatever damage is dealt to you. That means that if you want to maximize your damage, you need to use the Blackest Night only when the barrier will be fully consumed. Otherwise, you're losing out on the damage potency. So because of this, you need to keep an eye on your MP, keeping it from overcapping to avoid damage loss, but also plan ahead and keep some MP to mitigate damage whenever you need it. Some people don't like how this interplay between dealing optimal damage and not trolling your healer works, but I personally think that it's fun and very unique. Outside of this gimmick, there are some unique actions in the kit, including Salted Earth, which lets you place an AoE on the ground that deals damage over time and can be reused to deal instant damage. Living Shadow, which summons a simulacrum that will help you in combat once every 2 minutes, and Delirium, which gives you access to Dark Knight's shiny new Scarlet Delirium combo. Outside of that, there are a bunch of new OGCDs to use, which can make Dark Knight feel quite busy. You're kind of vibing for 100 seconds, and then you're aggressively rolling your face across the keyboard for 20 seconds during the burst window. Mitigation-wise, Dark Knight obviously has the previously mentioned TBN. One additional benefit of this action is that it's on a much shorter cooldown than equivalent mitigation abilities of some other tanks, allowing you to use it multiple times in succession if you have the MP saved up for it. For example, during the first Extreme Trial fight, this was already great for the Tank Buster where you have to repeatedly soak the tower. The fact that it's also tied to damage, you get to use it much more often, and you need to make sure that you have enough MP to use it whenever it's up, also means that I would say it's the only real mitigation that I'd claim as having some form of actual skill expression and room for optimization that goes unnoticed by average players. 2 stacks of a small mitigation ability called Oblation let you squeeze in small amounts of mitigation during times where you aren't necessarily just being hit by tank busters, because you can always save a stack for when you need it. You can use the other one when you usually wouldn't mitigate on other jobs. Another interesting aspect of Dark Knight's mitigation are Dark Missionary and Dark Mind, which reduce incoming magic damage. While you'd think it being limited to magic damage would make it somewhat weird to use, a surprising amount of raid wights and tank busters are actually magic damage. So these 2 abilities are not nearly as niche as you might think. Dark Knight's invulnerability is Living Dead, which will change their status to Walking Dead whenever their HP drops to 0, preventing them from dying but also requiring them to be fully healed before the timer runs out. To help with that, Dark Knight received a self-heal that applies per weapon skill hit during last expansion, probably because dealing with that was miserable for new Sage players. The main changes to Dark Knight and Dawntrail included new animations during Delirium, a removal of potency from their dash, which reduces the overall spam needed during burst windows and opens up room for more exciting actions, as well as the addition of Disesteem, another weapon skill that becomes available during Living Shadow every 2 minutes. Because of the very unique mitigation ability, the magic damage mitigation that is somewhat odd to use, and fairly spammy burst windows, as well as the fact that you need to manage an additional gauge in the MP bar, I'll rate the difficulty slightly higher than Warrior at 3 out of 5. Next up is Paladin. Despite using a sword and shield, this job is basically a caster in disguise due to the high amount of ranged instant cast spells available in their regular rotation. The job has a basic 1-2-3 combo that grants access to a ranged spell as well as another melee combo. The ranged action grants them a short burst of free movement, which they can use to avoid situations where other tanks might have to fight for melee uptime. Every minute, Paladins enter a short burst window under a damage buff called Fight or Flight, where they will use instant cast spells, granting them 10 seconds of ranged actions. This can be amazing during some fights and completely useless during others, depending on the mechanics of the boss. Outside of that, Paladin has a few OGCDs to weave into their rotation every 30 seconds, 1 time in and 1 time outside of the Fight or Flight window every 1 minute. When it comes to mitigation, Paladin is the only tank that uses a defensive gauge, which gives you access to Holy Sheltron. Using this consumes 50 gauge and applies mitigation as well as healing. It can also be cast on allies using intervention. In return for the complication with the gauge, this action is on a short 5-second cooldown, meaning if you need a lot of mitigation, for example during repeated tank busters, you can save up some of the resource. Outside of that, you'll be using Holy Sheltron or intervention to stop yourself from capping it, much the same way other jobs would use damaging spender actions to stop their gauge from capping. Guardian is Paladin's heaviest mitigation tool, providing 40% damage reduction and a massive barrier. The job also has access to some very niche and unique mitigation and utility options, making it an interesting pick. Bulwark blocks attacks for a short period of time. The blocking mechanic is unique to Paladin and is essentially just an upgraded parry. Unlike a parry, however, which all jobs have access to, blocking works for both physical and magical attacks. Paladin used to have a block instead of damage reduction on Holy Sheltron 2, but this was changed during last expansion Pandemonium Savage Raids, where many tank busters would apply a bleed effect, leaving Paladins to suffer because block does not work on damage over time effects. When it comes to party mitigation, Paladins have access to Divine Veil, which applies a party-wide barrier and also instantly restores some health to everyone, as well as Passage of Arms, which is arguably one of the coolest looking actions in the game. This will create a zone behind the Paladin, providing mitigation for anyone behind them. Unfortunately, they're not able to use any actions while this is active, and due to the nature of 14's combat, it's rarely used because of that. Because the loss of damage is far worse than not having an extra bit of mitigation, so you'll only really want to use this if the boss is untargetable. Cover will also consume 50 gauge and have the Paladin tank all of the damage intended for a targeted party member. This can be a great way to save party members from certain death, but requires a lot of awareness to use correctly. Next is Clemency, which is a targeted healing spell with a decent potency. Because it's on the global cooldown, Paladins should usually leave the healing to their healers due to the damage loss. However, there are cases where it's useful to salvage runs. You might be able to use it to carry fights over the finish line if a healer dies, or to heal yourself or another player in an emergency situation. Paladin's invulnerability is called Hallowed Ground. This will render them impervious to most attacks, as it says, stopping all incoming damage. Despite this being on a pretty long cooldown, I find that it's more useful in dungeons compared to that of other tanks, because they can only use theirs while they are at low health, so it's a great tool to use during big dungeon pulls without giving your healer a heart attack. The changes to Paladin and Dawntrail include new animations for the Atonement combo, which previously looked pretty boring for how often you would use it, an upgrade to Requiescat, which is now called Imperator, as well as a new OGCD follow-up to the Confiteor combo. As it stands, you need to be pretty creative to get the most out of this fairly niche defensive toolkit, which is why I'll rate the difficulty at 3 out of 5 stars on par with Dark Knight. Lastly, let's talk about Gunbreaker. This job uses a gunblade and is renowned for being perhaps the hardest tank to play from a rotation standpoint. Basically, you'll play a job that feels like you're pressing twice the amount of buttons and requires you to meditate on the meaning of life mid-fight for basically dealing roughly the same damage as all of the other tanks. While it is commonly on top of the DPS charts, only occasionally overtaken by Dark Knight in the last expansion, the differences aren't as big as some other people might want you to believe. The main difficulty of the job stems from the fact that Gunbreaker is more punishing if you mess up than other tanks. So once you start messing up, it's much more difficult than other jobs to realign everything, and you'll pretty much just be in a world of hurt. While doing your basic combo, you'll be accumulating a resource called cartridges. You can hold 3 of these and they can be spent on various actions in an order of priority, from Double Down to Gnashing Fang to Burst Strike in single target situations, and every minute you'll enter a damage window using No Mercy, a strong personal damage buff. Using the correct damaging abilities during this window is critical to mastering the job and represents the main hurdle. Not only is the order of the GCDs a little bit weird, but you'll also be double weaving a lot of the OGCDs due to the continuation action, which grants you access to an ability upon using each of the Gnashing Fang combo actions. Add to that 2 other OGCD damage actions, Bloodfest, which grants 3 extra cartridges and access to even more new GCDs, and the fact that regular mitigation might also need to be woven in, and you have one of the busiest burst windows out of all of the tanks. Because No Mercy is such a big damage buff, messing up this burst window is pretty catastrophic for Gunbreaker. Mitigation-wise, Gunbreaker has access to Heart of Corundum. Like the equivalent actions that other jobs have, this also provides 15% mitigation for themselves or others, while also providing some healing. Great Nebula is the heaviest defensive tool, providing flat mitigation as well as increasing the Gunbreaker's maximum health in the same way as Warrior's Thrill of Battle. Camouflage will increase the parry rate and reduce incoming damage. Unlike blocking, parrying only works on physical attacks. And because of this, As well as the parry not being guaranteed, this action is somewhat unreliable for dealing with tank busters, but generally a useful tool nonetheless. For example, when dealing with big dungeon pulls, where the parry rate can really shine, mitigating many instances of incoming damage, with a good chance to trigger at 50%. With Aurora, Gunbreaker has a useful heal that is somewhat weaker than Warrior's Equilibrium for personal healing, but can hold 2 stacks to either use on yourself or party members. Gunbreaker's invulnerability is Super Bolite, which causes their health to drop to 1, making them impervious to most attacks, just like Paladin. This means that while they pretty much have to use their gunblade against themselves, at least they should be pretty easy to heal up afterwards. You will at one point use Super Bolite when you get low, just after a White Mage restores all of your health with a benediction before you can realize it. It's tradition and somewhat of a rite of passage for aspiring Gunbreakers. Overall, to me, Gunbreaker's mitigation tools are perhaps the least interesting out of all of the 4 tanks, because each of the other ones has their quirks. Warrior's self-healing, Paladin's very heavy mitigation, and Dark Knight's TBN tying into their damage, as well as magic damage reductions, which kind of leaves Gunbreaker with nothing truly unique. But all of this may be by design, considering how much other stuff Gunbreaker has to deal with in their rotation. In Dawntrail, Gunbreaker's dash had its potency removed, making the job feel somewhat less spammy than before, just like Dark Knight. The AoE cartridge spender Fated Circle now also has a follow-up through continuation, and Bloodfast grants access to the Lionheart combo, a series of 3 GCDs you'll be using to finish up your burst. Difficulty-wise, Gunbreaker isn't the most difficult job in the game, but it is certainly somewhere up there. The fact that continuation actions need to be used immediately and can be lost accidentally, the fact that you need to save cartridges for not only 1 but 2 actions on cooldown, where if you don't have enough cartridges, you won't be able to use them and thus drift your entire rotation, the possibility of accidentally overcapping your cartridges using Bloodfest, the heavy reliance on making all of this happen inside of your No Mercy window, and lastly the fact that gauge management is much harder going into burst windows in the first place, all make me want to give Gunbreaker a 4 out of 5 on the difficulty scale compared to all other jobs in the game. In summary, here's who I would recommend the different jobs to. Warrior is an easy tank, still one of my favorite for beginner players to get into tanking. With great self-healing, it's a fantastic job for solo content too, and perhaps the most desired main tank. Dark Knight is slightly more challenging than Warrior and has more of a spammy feel to it. Because of its decent damage, it's currently my favorite off-tank choice. Paladin is a fantastic utility-focused option with many more unique tools for helping the party. I'd personally recommend it for slightly more experienced players or beginners who won't shy away from trying to understand the niche utility tools. And lastly, Gunbreaker to me feels like a more rotation-focused option with easy mitigation options, as well as a spammy burst window and more room for error and damage loss. If regular tanks are slightly too boring for you, then you should give this job a try. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you in the next one. Peace.